Next slide. So what they're valuing is what they call counter-publics, right? That's a very long, fancy word. But all that it really means is public spaces where opportunities exist for living otherwise, desiring otherwise, not conforming to certain kinds of norms. So the after-hours club, for them, is an example, potentially, of a counter-public. But so too could be an activist site, so too could be a book club, so too could be something like this center here, right? A counter-public, where people are able to assemble and have conversations and ask questions that run counter to the social consensus. And they're saying that queer sex has depended upon this, because if you think about a context where people are kicked out of their families, or they're told, you're gay, you can't be here, you know, by their parents, by their relatives, and so on, well, then historically, queer people have had to seek intimacy and sex in public places. Parks, the street, clubs, bars, tea rooms, bathrooms, right? There has been this kind of robust publicness about queer intimacy. That's why they call the essay Sex in Public. But their anxiety is that these spaces are becoming increasingly endangered, right? That they are disappearing, and that queer culture is now becoming intensely privatized. Because what heteronormativity does is that it insists that sex should be private. It should never be public. Right? The idea is that proper sex happens between two people behind closed doors in a house where the emphasis is on private property, right? So public sex for them is kind of foundationally queer, even when it's being had among heterosexual people. And the reason I bring all of this up is because when they're worried about the elimination of queer culture in the mid-90s, things that happen afterwards kind of prove them right. And I give as an example the Supreme Court case from a few years ago in the United States that made gay marriage legal, right? So gay marriage is now legal throughout the United States, in all 50 states. And in order to do that, the first thing that had to happen in a Supreme Court decision that happened in 2003, that was called Lawrence v. Texas, is that gay sex had to be decriminalized, right? So up until 2003, in most of the United States, it was still illegal for non-heterosexual sex to happen. And it was outlawed under these sodomy laws, right? So sodomy is a broad category that means unnatural sex, but by and large, it was used to target queer people. And they could be sent to prison, they would have to pay these fines, right? In 2003, the Supreme Court overturned these sodomy laws. So it was hailed as an important victory for queer people and a kind of prelude to the next big decision that would come about a decade later that made marriage legal. But there's one thing you have to know about these Supreme Court decisions in the US, which is that they're not as radical as they might have seemed. Because in the particular example that was involved in this Lawrence v. Texas case in 2003, what happened is that a man was angry at his ex, because his ex had left him, right? So he was disgruntled, heartbroken, whatever. And he called the police on his ex and the ex's new partner or lover, I don't know, right? And the police raided the man's house. He made up a story that his ex was being attacked or that his house had been broken into, right? The police entered. They found him having sex with his new partner. And this next detail always gets left out of this story in the US, which is that the partner was a man of color, right? So the police barge in, they find him with this man of color, and he ends up the two of them end up getting arrested for sodomy, right? Unnatural sex in their house, right? It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ends up overturning the lower court decisions. They side with the gay men. They say these men cannot be charged with sodomy, okay? But here's the catch. They didn't say no one ever could be charged with sodomy. They said what protects these two men is the fact that they were having sex in the bedroom in a house that one of them either rented or owned. So what protected them was precisely the privacy of the sex they were having. What does that mean? It means that if you're caught having sex in a bar or a club or in many of the spaces like a park that queer people have historically used to pursue sex, you can still be charged with sodomy in the United States. And in fact, people are still charged with sodomy in the United States. In my hometown of Virginia, 1 year after this Supreme Court decision, a family friend of ours, who I did not know had sex with men, not that I needed to know, was arrested at a YMCA, an athletic facility, for having sex with a man in the locker room, and he was charged with sodomy, with unnatural sex. Now, where queer theory is more than just a theory about gender and sexuality is exactly along these lines, where it links up with critiques of neoliberalism. And I would imagine that a lot of you are familiar with the term neoliberalism, right? Which is broad, and we could have a whole conversation about it, but generally refers to the privatization of everything, right? The marketization of everything. I know that here in Greece, you're very familiar through austerity with the principles of neoliberalism that involve cutting back public resources, privatizing provisions that used to be public, whether that's education or healthcare or retirement, transportation, electricity, various kinds of utilities, right? Neoliberalism is an ideology that stresses privatization, that stresses marketization. And what this example of sodomy is meant to show you is that queer culture risks becoming diluted and then complicit with neoliberalism to the degree that it anchors itself in a logic of privacy, right? Queer is okay so long as it's private, right? Queer is okay as long as it's not public, as long as it doesn't challenge sort of social protocols, neighborhood protocols, community protocols, right? And the reason that this is also intensely neoliberal, and I should have said this already, is because it systematically works against and disadvantages queer people of color, poor queer people, homeless queer people who have been kicked out of their homes, queer youths in particular, queer adolescents, right? People who are most vulnerable, most exposed, most in need of social provision, and yet find themselves ignored or actively persecuted not only by kind of, the powers that be, the police, government officials, but even by other queer people who look at them as shameful reminders of a queer past. It's like, oh my God, they're still pursuing sex in parks. Oh my God, they're still like homeless. Isn't queer culture supposed to be this very like consumer-friendly, billboard-friendly gay pride event where what we're celebrating is gay wealth, right, in a sense? So this system of kind of the neoliberalization of queerness is one built on the backs of people of color, the working class, people with disabilities, young queer people, and so on, for whom marriage is not the primary concern, right? I mean, this is the other issue, is that mainstream LGBT organizations in the United States for many, many years prioritized marriage as their flagship issue, right? They were like, this is the one that we're going to pursue. Right after they had pursued another one, which was military inclusion, right? So it's like, what do we want from our government? We want them to let us fight imperial wars, and we want them to let us marry, right? But then what weren't they asking for? Well, they weren't asking for affordable housing, After HIV/AIDS became a more manageable illness in the United States, they stopped asking for certain kinds of healthcare provision. They stopped asking for, public education. I mean, all of these other institutions that would be particularly beneficial for vulnerable queer people, for young queer people, for queer people of color, those got kind of brushed under the rug, and marriage and military service became the flagship issues. And why is that? I mean, I think we have to think very critically about why that is. Well, it's an assimilative impulse, right? It's like this is the way that you get accepted by mainstream culture. You marry and you serve in the military, right? So it's very much tied to this question of nationhood, right? Being a good citizen, the right kind of citizen of your country. One of the most important insights of Berlant and Warner's essay, called Sex in Public, is that heterosexuality insists that we think about sex as private, right? But it is actually the opposite of that, right? Heterosexuality is everywhere. It's soaked in to the culture, right? So actually, heterosexuality is everywhere. It's hyper public. It's hyper evident. But it's so everywhere that in a certain sense, it's nowhere. In other words, it's so ubiquitous that you don't even see it, right? I'll give you an example of this that I often give when I'm teaching this concept. It's very common, and because I'm from the US, I like to stay in the US because I don't like generalizing about other nations, other people, right? So you can tell me whether this happens in Greece or not. But it's very common in the US when people are homophobic and they're worried about gay men, for them to invoke children as like the reason that they're worried about gay people. And the fear that they articulate is that gay people are going to like rub off on their children, right? That their children are going to become gay because they're exposed to gay people. And so what they will say is like, I don't want my child to come into contact with that kind of sexual information, right? I want to keep my child kind of unsexed, right? The gay person will contaminate them with sexual thoughts, sexual language, whatever, right? A lot of times, the defense of that is that queer people will make is like, no, they won't, right? Gay men are just like you. They're normal, they're nice, they would never, whatever. And, to some degree, there's value in that. But another way to look at this is that you shouldn't take these homophobic people at their word, because what they're saying is that they don't want their child to be sexualized. But all the time, you see, they'll have like a 1-year-old, let's say it's a boy, and he'll like wave at a random woman who's walking by, and they'll say things like, oh, see, you can tell he's a ladies' man already. He's flirting with her, right? And you're like, you're fucking sexualizing your child. Not to mention that you've already grafted onto him quite often this very rigid gender identity, but then on top of that, a sexual identity that's presumed always to be straight. And this is what Berlant and Warner mean. The public sphere is already hypersexualized, but it's hypersexualized as heterosexual. And it's so hyper, it's so ubiquitous that we take it for granted, we see it as normal, and therefore, in a certain sense, we don't even see it. We don't even see the ways, we don't make visible the ways in which heterosexuality imposes itself on the public sphere. So it's simply not true. On the one hand, Berlant and Warner they're wanting to defend public cultures of queer sex and queer intimacy, but they're also refusing to accept that it's only queer people who insist upon public sex. They're saying, no, straight people insist upon public sex all the time. It's just that it's so everywhere that you don't even see it. On to the next slide. And by the way, that's what all ideologies do, ultimately, right? That's the goal of any ideology. A gender, a sexual, a racial ideology is to be so powerfully taken for granted that it doesn't even look like an ideology, right? And all an ideology is a way of viewing the world. But the way that an ideology becomes dominant is by becoming so widespread and so taken for granted that it no longer seems like an ideology. It instead seems like nature or reality or just the way things are, you know? So let's say that you turn to a friend and you're like, you know, why can't we get really high quality free healthcare? And the friend says to you, get real, right? You know, get real there is functioning ideologically, but it's made to look like realism, like stone cold realism. Like you just need to accept the facts. That's when you know ideologies are at their best, when they're masquerading as something else. At the end of their essay, Sex in Public, and I do encourage you to read it, Berlant and Warner are thinking about the ways in which queerness goes beyond people who identify as LGBT. And in this particular case, they give two examples of queer culture. They, at this time, are in Chicago, and they're riding around with a straight couple that they know. And the straight couple, because they know that Berlant and Warner do queer theory and that, you know, that they're open to listening to it, they begin telling them that they've gotten really interested in sex toys, this straight couple. But they're like confiding it. They're like, we could only tell you two this because we can't tell our straight friends. They'll think we're deviant or perverted. And so they're like sharing that they have found these sex toys and the pleasure that they're finding in it. And Berlant and Warner write, their bodies, this straight couple, their bodies have become disorganized and exciting to them. But they feel they can't discuss it with straight friends without being called perverts. And the argument they're making here is that even just among four people in a car, there is a gesture here toward a public queer space, right? Where they're talking about sex, they're talking about non-normative sex. They're not talking about gay sex, right? This is a straight couple, but their bodies are feeling queer to them because they are experiencing pleasure in a way that many of their friends would call non-normative or abnormal. And this is what I mean when I say that queerness need not be critical, right? Because for all I know, this straight couple does not then take this and go, you know what, we need to fight the patriarchy, and we need to fight, you know, the couple form, and we need to fight monogamy. I have no idea, right? But they're experiencing their bodies as queer because they're receiving pleasure in ways that they had not learned that they could. What they then do with that information, whether they politicize it or not, that's a separate question. The other example that they give is this public sex event that they attend that's based around erotic vomiting. And there are two men involved, but the bottom, and so in this event, one man is shoving food down another man's throat, bringing him right to the edge of vomiting, but not quite. So it's like a kind of edging, right? But not masturbation, not that kind of edging, but like, you know, edging the throat, edging the larynx, edging the, you know, pharyngeal system, let's say, right? And the bottom, so the one who's receiving the food and who is being brought to the edge of vomiting, they find out is actually heterosexual, right? So he receives pleasure from this other man kind of force-feeding him and being brought to the edge of vomiting, but he doesn't identify as gay, right? In his kind of other sexual activity, he has sex with women. What is queer about this? Well, you have two men engaged in this very erotic exercise, but it's not just that. It's also that one of them is straight, the bottom, right? The intimacy is degenitalized, right? So this has nothing to do with the penis or the rectum or a vagina, nothing, right? The eroticism is at the level of the throat. And they are registering a desire for public forms of sex. Not just them, because part of their enjoyment is tied up in the exhibition, in other people watching them. But the people watching them are also registering a desire for public forms of sex, right? They are enjoying watching this. And so there's something queer on multiple levels about the spectators, about the participants. A few years ago in the United States, there was this big scandal at a university. And actually, this happened at multiple universities. Anna and I used to both teach at Cal State Los Angeles, and it had its own version of this controversy, where like a student group put on an event about sex toys. And parents, other people found out about it. They were very upset. At Cal State LA, they actually shut the event down. At other universities, it went forward. They had the event, and there was like a public outcry. And the way that it was, and you know, this was about, you know, setting up tables with sex toys, people like, you know, explaining how they work, what you do with them, how it feels, and all of that, right? But at one event, things in the view of the authorities got out of control, and someone proceeded to like use one of the sex toys in front of the other people, right, you know. And the way that this was defended was, well, it was meant to be educational, right? It was about showing people, right? And so the defense was purely about knowledge and education. What no one could say, I mean, I read multiple stories about this, what no one could dare say is that maybe it was just possible that a lot of people liked watching that person use that sex toy on themselves, right? That was like the defense you couldn't articulate, right? You had to say, yeah, things got a little out of hand, but it was meant to be educational. Where in fact, what Berlant and Warner would say is like, no, what that situation that got out of hand indexed is that there is a desire for public sex and for provisions of public sex. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's not the case. And in fact, queer culture has a long history of valuing these public sex encounters. Berlant and Warner also point out that the pleasures of these men involved in this erotic vomiting activity were not purchased by a redemptive pastoralism of sex or by mandatory amnesia about failure, shame, and aversion. Now that's a rather fancy quote, but what they're saying here is that what also makes this sex act queer is that it's not romantic in kind of a pastoral, idealistic way, right? Like, oh, these two men love each other, and oh, what they really want is to, you know, be together for all time or something. Like, no, that's not what this was about. And also, because it was fundamentally about vomiting, it was fundamentally about being on the edge of throwing up, it made very explicit the ways in which queer sex can be experienced as aversive or even gross or even difficult or having elements of shame about them, right? And that's okay, right? It's often the case that in kind of like a rush to gay pride, we say, oh, you shouldn't feel any shame when you have sex. That's a sign that you're outdated or you've just internalized homophobia or you hate yourself. Whereas queer theory actually recognizes that sex is a really complicated experience for a lot of reasons. And it might carry shame, and it might carry feelings of aversion, and it might carry feelings of uncertainty or ambivalence. And that's okay. And the more that we make that something that can be talked about and accessible and even kind of accessed through like this sort of public performance, the more that queer culture can build itself around a very robust idea of sex rather than kind of a simplified, romanticized version of sex. Next slide, Anna. So we're moving on now, and we're also nearing the end of to Eve Sedgwick's work from Epistemology of the Closet. And I'm going to just kind of quickly move through some of Sedgwick's main insights. She argues that it's important to distinguish between gender and sexuality so as not to lose focus on the feminist project of illuminating gendered oppression, right? So Sedgwick is writing in this moment in the early 1990s when people are increasingly thinking about sex and gender kind of, colliding, intersecting. And she values that. But she also thinks that the feminist project and the queer project are not identical with each other. And we can talk more maybe afterwards about why that is. So she very much insists that we do need to have moments where we're not collapsing the two into each other. But that is not to say that we should ever take the word sex for granted, right? And if we go back to Judith Butler's point about gender being performative, one of the most radical claims that Butler makes in Gender Trouble is that if gender is performative, if gender is something that we do and not something that we are, and if we do it with our bodies, the way we talk, the way we walk, who we have sex with, whatever, well then sex at some level is performative too, and gender indeed goes all the way down, right? So there's kind of like a tradition that's very much alive today, even in very progressive circles, where people will say sex is biological, it's the ground, it's like, if you do fractions, it's the denominator, right? But that what's up top is gender. Gender is the social interpretation of the biological fact of sex. So many people are willing to grant you that gender is socially constructed, but they say sex is not. Sex is foundational, it's essential, it's biological, it's chromosomal, whatever. Butler says no, gender goes all the way down. There is no biological fact. Now, she doesn't deny, and I want to be very clear about this, that there are biological phenomena. She grants the existence of biological phenomena. But her point is that what we do with those biological phenomena is a cultural thing. It's a social thing. And therefore, it's happening at the level of gender, meaning that it's subject to social norms, meaning that it is performative. So Butler does not allow a firm distinction between sex and gender. And you could argue in many ways that she allows almost no distinction at all.